Hi everyone. Welcome to this month's roundtable. We are the members of the International Relations Cluster of Nickel Time, which is the official research and publication platform for the Center for New Economic Studies. So for today's roundtable, we have Mallika, Sashank, and myself as the panelists, and Rushil is going to be moderating the conversation. Rushil, do you want to go ahead and give a brief introduction about the topic and what we're going to be discussing today?
Sure. Today we're going to be discussing a very pertinent issue in geopolitics today, which is the China-Taiwan issue. And we are today going to be pondering over the implications of China-Taiwan issue over the next 10 to 15 years. Well, this situation has recently aggravated since Nancy Pelosi's visit, uncalled for visit, according to the Chinese authorities in Taiwan. And since then, we have seen a range of actions which display Chinese aggression, which have violated Taiwan's territorial integrity and the sovereignty of their own people. And now all of us, everyone in the international space is now wondering what is the course of action that's going to take place, because Nancy Pelosi's uncalled visit has certainly catalyzed certain actions which were waiting to happen. So now, in today's discussion, we're going to talk about a range of economic, military, and geopolitical implications that the China-Taiwan issue now presents, not just for China-Taiwan and the Southeast Asian region, but for India as well, and all the other pertinent global powers such as US and Russia. So let's get started. So the first question that is of issue would be, since Nancy Pelosi's visit, China has taken a range of offensive measures which violate the territorial integrity of Taiwan. What military measures do you expect from both sides going forward?
Okay. May I answer this question?
Sure, go ahead.
So something that we have noticed is that China has been very aggressive in marking its territory and even sort of trying to expand its territory. And China has maintained that even though that Taiwan, even though it's self-governing, is part of the Chinese territory. And they have always maintained their aggression, that sort of stance that they will not accept anything else. It's the same thing that we saw with Hong Kong. And Nancy Pelosi, who has been an advocate has mainly advocated so thoroughly against Chinese military action in relation to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan massacre, and even the Tiananmen Square, and even the recent Hong Kong protests. Her visit, her as a figurehead in politics, in American politics, is just sort of always aggravated Chinese officials, and her going to Taiwan is just created a sort of strife within these two countries of Taiwan and China, and created a new set of problems for Taiwan, but it's also given them a more secure defense, because her visit also proclaims that Taiwan will not be alone in its fight against China. And so what China has been doing after her visit has been, they've been having military drills, and they have been launching ballistic missiles and having other drills which are basically just aggressive tactics across the coast of the silent nation. And China and Taiwan, in response to this, has adopted a sort of occupying strategy, saying that we might not be able, which basically is just insinuating that we might not be able to fight you. We might not have the same power to fight one of the largest armies in the world, but we will not go down easily. So Taiwan has really stocked up on a lot of anti-air, anti-sea strategies, anti-sea weaponry, because the only two ways to get to Taiwan, the island nation, one of its main key factors is that you can only get to it by air, or you can get to it by sea, and air travel is limited in, transporting goods and soldiers. So it will be mostly by sea that which China does take on any sort of land occupation of Taiwan will have to be by carrying their soldiers overseas. And so by investing in sea mines and sea weaponry and submarines and unmanned submarines, Taiwan is prepared. While China does have the resources to sort of, take out all of this weaponry without too much of a dent in their budget or in their resources, but still it will make an impact on them and it will protect the Taiwanese people longer. And Taiwan is expecting a war, is expecting a possible war, especially after the Russia-Ukraine situation had escalated. Taiwan began having air raids, like practice air drills, and to sort of like familiarize their citizens, especially in the urban areas, on how to get to what is the procedure to get into like barracks and everything, underground bunkers for their own safety. So while we are not, again, it's not really certain the route that China will take, we are like Taiwan is prepared, and Taiwan does think that war might be inevitable.
A very well crafted point, Mallika. Ishani, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so about how you mentioned that Taiwan is expecting a war. I feel a war would be like a very far-fetched possibility. And I say that, I mean, a lot of us were proven wrong when we said that a war is not likely in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But like nobody really could have predicted Russia to go into like a full-blown invasion. But again, I feel the difference here is that China's economy is a lot more integrated when it comes to, and it's a lot more dependent, and it cannot really afford sanctions. So, and there would be a lot of sanctions if China were to say to a similar act as Russia, invade Taiwan. So I would not really agree that there might be like a full-fledged war. There's not a high possibility, but other than that, along with Taiwan, of course, doing what it can to like defend itself in case such a thing happens, I feel what it's also doing is strengthening its ties with the US. And that is what the US is doing as well. After Nancy Pelosi's visit, there were a lot of US lawmakers or policymakers who like visited Taiwan to, reaffirm that, even if China continues to do these military drills to threaten or, discourage Taiwan from having close relations with the US, we're still going to go ahead and like support Taiwan in whichever way we can. So just wanted to add that.
All right. I think that covers this issue pretty comprehensively. Now let's move on to the next question, which I think is rather very interesting. China has resorted to economically pressure Taiwan by including a range of sanctions. To the best of your ability, forecast the possible actions taken by the global powers in this scenario. So what we have seen up until now is a back and forth going between China and Taiwan. But we both know that there are global powers which are backing each party. In the case of Taiwan, we can say the US is backing them. And in the case of China, we can say that Russia is pretty comprehensively backing them. Besides that, do you see any other global powers, even US, Russia, and any other global powers, do you see any sort of economic actions that they're going to take to support either China or Taiwan in this case? Yes, Sashank, go ahead.
So after Pelosi's flight first landed in Taiwan, China reacted quite aggressively. They had sanctioned Pelosi and disrupted dialogue mechanisms they had with the USA. They imposed an import embargo on fruits, vegetables, and other perishable goods, and citing pesticides as a reason. Whether you make it, what do you make it or not is for you. But they even stopped exporting sand. So again, and they, as Mallika and Ishani said in their previous answers, they were conducting military drills very close by. But given all of that, I still don't think the global powers as such can do anything as of now. That is purely because of the reason China hasn't yet invaded Taiwan per se. All their actions are actually within what you can do. It's very aggressive, yes, but you can still do it. Like the missiles that they are sending in, it hasn't landed in the exclusive economic zone, so you can't really say anything. For the if you're stopping the export of the sands, you won't get a WTO sanction because they said they're having a housing crisis, and hence you can make up for that excuse as well. Similarly, for the pesticides reason, they have got that covered as well. So even though you could call them as a big excuse, the global powers as such are not in a position right now to sanction China, especially we also need to take into consideration the global inflation crisis with, with China being a global manufacturing hub. You need to really consider imposing sanctions on China without exacerbating the crisis, especially in the West as well as in America. So as of now, the West can't really do much unless unless China really attacks Taiwan per se and kind of take over their island.
Yeah, fair point raised. But if we look at Taiwan, for example, and look, Taiwan is in dire need for any help they can get right now because Taiwan is facing an aggregator in China. If we ponder over in the Taiwan scenario, what sort of possible solutions can Taiwan look towards, economically speaking? Be it privateer, be it MNCs, or be it global powers, what sort of solutions do you think that they can pursue going forward?
I think one thing that Taiwan is already doing is strengthening its trade ties with other nations. And that is something that is still a possibility and something that Taiwan would look forward to do in this scenario. Because I think I read somewhere that Ukraine was economically way weaker than what Taiwan is right now. It's economically, at least relatively, very stronger than Ukraine. So it's not in that position. And plus, considering the semiconductor industry in the country, it's gonna what it can do right now is just establish or even like strengthen trade ties with other countries, including India, and what it is actually doing since the past few years.
Yeah, that's a very well point. That's a good point that you raised. All right, let's move on to the next question. And now we're going to be focusing on India a little bit. So India's take on this issue has been rather ambivalent. India has shied away from talking about the one China grand strategy amidst the China-Taiwan issue. What implications, course of action do you see India personally taking in this scenario?
Like, okay, so before we move on to talking about why India is practicing strategic ambiguity, I just want to like talk about what India has actually done. So initially India was not even like recognizing what was really happening in Taiwan, but then as things escalated, it did say that there's a need to maintain peace and stability in the region. It also said that like countries should avoid unilateral action to change the status quo, and all of that again shows that India is taking a very it's practicing strategic ambiguity, which is sort of like our go-to whenever such a major thing happens. And I mean, to be very honest, I think that is quite right as well. um India, since 2010, India has not really reaffirmed its support for the one China policy, and rightly so, given what China is doing in the Northeast. And another major point that people usually forget is what China has done in the West. Talking about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the disputed territory which India claims, the Gilgit-Baltistan region, China went ahead with Pakistan to like build a project on it and did not take India into consideration at all. So China is not really paying any respect to India's territorial sovereignty. Why on earth does it expect India to do the same for itself? And that I mean, for India to practice strategic ambiguity, say that our policies and our what we believe in is like already well established. We don't need to reiterate. I mean, all of that does make sense. Talking about the implications, of course, the region would have get a lot more hostile, and that would have an effect. But also economically, we are already facing, including the world, we're already facing a lot of inflationary pressures, and we're still grappling with the repercussions of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and a similar conflict in China, Taiwan, and especially given that India imports around 75% of its semiconductors from Taiwan, and if that supply chain gets disrupted, India will definitely face a major economic drawback. So these are some of the implications and also India's stance on the whole issue.
Okay, Mallika, you want to go ahead? Okay, I think she's frozen.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just on to what Ishani said, India hasn't really reaffirmed its one China policy. And recently, when the late Minister of External Affairs, Sushma Swaraj, was there, when asked about it explicitly, I think she had said, let they agree on the one India policy first, and then we'll think about one China policy first. So it's kind of like that. The situation has now turned hostile, especially after the Galwan Valley clashes and the Arunachal Pradesh issues as well. And India has been steadily making a little bit of inroads with the Taiwan relations without really, angering China a lot. We have the India-Taiwan Association. You have the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Center in New Delhi. And right now, as Ishani pointed out, because of the semiconductor dependency that India has on Taiwan, we are slowly trying to, get them to India and have their bases situated in India as well. So they are making some steady progresses. Even when the swearing in of the ceremonies and the death of their former prime ministers and all, India had always sent their envoys and had expressed its deepest concerns and things like that. So the relations are they have been somewhat muted, that is to say, but they are picking up some pace in the recent past.
Ishani, I wanted to inquire about one thing that you talked about, and I think if you could further expound on it, would be great. You talked about this notion of strategic ambiguity, right? And this strategic ambiguity has been highlighted in the Russia-Ukraine crisis about how India has been, maybe we could say, on the fence about these issues, and how India hasn't really condemned Russia because of India's dependence on oil and energy on Russia itself. But when we talk about China, why do we have a strategic ambiguity in the case of China? As you mentioned prior, China and Pakistan have collaborated. China have never considered or dimly considered India in their actions in the global political space or in Southeast Asian region. So why is it that India still has this notion of strategic ambiguity, or doesn't just come out and say, no, we don't believe in this one China policy. According to us, it's complete garbage. Why doesn't India come out and say something like that along diplomatic lines? Why does it still have to maintain this gamut of strategic ambiguity in the case of China?
When I say strategic ambiguity, I don't mean that India is sort of taking like a back foot or it's being too lenient with China. That is so not the case. I mean, just recently, with the research vessel that docked at the Chinese research vessel that docked at the Hambantota port, India has been very outspoken about it and has had some diplomatic sort of spat with China. But what I feel is that India is still not in that position that it can openly call out China and say that take on China, that uh, like we do not agree with your one China policy, because still we are very much I won't say economically dependent on them, but we are very much economically integrated with them. And given that they are just like our neighbor and what they've been doing in the northeast, we cannot really afford them to do that aggressively, because I don't think we're still in that position. We're not strong enough. What we are doing with the Quad, with other alliances, with our I think we are holding drills with other Southeast Asian nations. What we're doing is sort of like building up to come to that level where we can actually take on China one day, but that is definitely not now. And that's why we are not being too lenient, but also not too aggressive when we're dealing with China.
Malika, you want to respond to this as well?
Yeah, and also in regards to the one China policy, India has been like getting off that stance since like 2008. We've seen like we have not been talking, like the government doesn't respond to the one China claims, doesn't follow that policy with by having like individual ties to different things like the Taiwan and Hong Kong also. So but China, and because the thing is that India wanted to like sort of change itself, wanted to like put itself apart to other Western nations, especially like America, and their like the kind of dependency that they were sort of creating on China. And by recognizing that, and even seeing how Pakistan was creating a dependency on China, I feel like India saw that and like was making its economic moves from then only, from like 2008 onwards. And we saw it like in the Make in India, like as soon as the Modi government came in, we saw the Make in India thing. We heard everybody talk. We heard the anti-China policies, and like even Diwali lights, people were like, "Nahi, hum Bharat se layenge. We will get the Indian-made ones, Indian-made goods." And it was just something that has been, I personally remember it, something that's at least been happening since 2012, 2013. I've been hearing it in the bazaars when I go, that everybody doesn't want Chinese mal nahi chahiye hame. And so it's sort of like India has been slightly trying to push its own consumers away from Chinese products by sort of pushing on like innovation from India and Indian products, or even from other nations. But I think the Chinese policy, it is very delicate, the relationship that we have with China, because by China has created relations with our neighbors of Pakistan, like, and even Sri Lanka, right? So it's like, it's a very delicate line that we have to sort of toe, at least our country does. But recently, China did respond to, India did respond to the claims of, did respond to what is happening in the Taiwan Strait, and has called it militarization of the Taiwanese Strait. And the High Commission of India in Sri Lanka said this, like China has militarized the Taiwanese Strait, which is actually very something shocking, like, because we never really hear India commenting on Chinese military action in other countries. In India and Indian like states and everything, we do hear it, especially in the Northeast. But we never hear India speak up in the on the invasion, like the invasion of land in Nepal and Burma sometimes. So this was something new.
Yeah, I think you've covered, both Ishani and you have covered this issue comprehensively. Let's move on to the next question. So this actually questions the Chinese narrative that has been going around. So the global narrative about China has been that it has been an ascending world power, which is going to challenge America's long-drawn hegemony in the global political space. However, following China's domestic troubles, as Sashank pointed out, the housing bubble and the internal discussions that China has faced, is there reason to believe that the China-Taiwan issue should be analyzed through a newer perspective? If so, how do you see the issue evolving in the next 10 to 15 years? Mallika, you want to go ahead with this one?
So, yeah, sorry. So something that I have, if India's policies do change and India does become the ease of doing business in India, India is going to become one of the fiercest competitors to China in terms of economy and its hold on the economy. China, the United States, and India will become like three of the largest powers. And India has sort of does have that dream. Like we have seen it, we've seen it with the Modi government, like they're constantly reiterating that they want to be a power, like the way their actions have been, their political moves have been. We see that India does want to be at that stage, wants to be not been at par, maybe even better than, and like just be that powerful. And so if India does get to that stage, India, I don't think we like will have a sort of, will want to sort of show that while showing respect, will not sort of show that sort of like submission to Chinese superiority, or like Chinese, what China, the policy that China puts forward, like especially like the one China policy we have been seeing, India has been pushing against it. But like any other policy, like we have seen recently, the USA has been sort of on the back foot and has been accepting few Chinese policies because of the, like how Ishani said, China has integrated itself into the global economy so deeply that we cannot afford to lose it. Up to like we can't afford to lose China or like create extreme sanctions against it. So especially we saw it with America, how hesitant they were to create extreme sanctions, like the same way they did with Russia against China.
Good point. Okay, Sashank, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. When when we always compare this with the Russian-Ukraine crisis, right? We always try to draw parallels from that as well. Normally, if you see the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was somewhat founded on the historical aspect of it as well as the security concerns of it. You know, it was always an erstwhile part of USSR, and we want it back. And with the NATO forces coming in, it'll endanger our security and things like that. While that is also somewhat true for the China-Taiwan issue as well, because you know the civil war was there, and then the Democratic Nationalistic Party had gone to Taiwan and claimed to be the real Taiwan and things like that. So there is this historical narrative that plays out in this aspect. However, we also need to look at the more of the economic and strategic point, which that kind of plays an important role here than what it did in the Ukraine-Russian war. With the Chinese economy somewhat slowing down and Xi Jinping not happy about it, he wants to really boost the exports and somewhat make the economy running again. And for that, as you know, Chinese economy is made up of like mainly two things: it's manufacturing and it's exporting capabilities. And they really need Taiwan, or they need Taiwan to be under their sphere of influence to be able to export better, because you know Taiwan is an international port city and port country really. So they need Taiwan for all that economic and strategic aspects, and moreover it sits on the maritime sea route, which is one of the most flooded and trafficked ones. So you have a lot of advantage when you are, you know, forcing yourself onto that. And also the South China being, if you're having control of Taiwan, you have a better control of South China Sea itself, and the economic prospects that it has, you know, the oil and gas. So China sees having Taiwan under its belt as a leverage to kind of flex its economic muscle and gain over an economic hegemony over the United States.
Yeah, good point. Ishani, go ahead.
Yeah, just building on and like adding to what Sashank and Mallika have said. I feel like, of course, you can look at it from a like economic perspective. That's like very relevant, but we need to see what China has been doing since the past decade or so. It, along with like challenging the US, and like it's seeking to build a China-led world order. And that, of course, it can only do when, you know, it replaces the US and like the Western world order. And it's very evident from the BRI and how it's trying to, you know, get involved and like have very strong relations or control over a lot of South Asian nations. We have Sri Lanka, we have Pakistan. It's trying to get into Afghanistan as well. Even Bangladesh. It's trying to have sort of it's trying to assert its supremacy over the region, trying to come out as a regional hegemon. And in that sense, Taiwan plays a really important role. Taiwan having very strong relations with the US directly is like a threat to China. And it's like this sort of builds on what China has been doing since some time, you know, talking about the Western, how bad the Western led world order is, and to, you know, sort of regain Taiwan and make sure that, you know, it doesn't go all out and have like strong relations with the US. But in a span of like 10 to 15 years, what I feel is that the region is going to get a lot more hostile, because if in the case of China invading Taiwan, the US will definitely intervene. And that would just definitely, like, it would just make the region a lot more hostile. And this could also sort of lead to these smaller countries, for example, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and all, being forced into the whole this big power play, which, and it would just like destruct them even more. But yeah, that's it.
So just to clarify, Shani, are you trying to say that a country such as Pakistan or Sri Lanka, which have an economic dependence in China, they're going to be a sort of proxy states in the China-Taiwan issue? Is that something you are trying to talk about or trying to say?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. So let's move on to our final question in this discussion. So we all know that Taiwan's expertise is in the semiconductor business, and that has made it a very important player in global politics. However, amidst the growing intensity of the China-Taiwan issue, do you see India becoming a suitable alternative in the technological space in the meanwhile? So yeah, Sashank, go ahead.
Yeah. So as we had talked about it earlier as well. So in its bid to somewhat develop the India-Taiwan relationship, just a week ago or so, some of the Taiwanese semiconductors were coming. Semiconductor companies came to India to have a preliminary round and check if it's feasible to set up their operations in India as well. And so India is trying to kind of become a player in the semiconductor business and try to add its value chain. So it's there is something called as the ATMP. It's called assembly, testing, marking, and packaging. I'm not able to the P part. I'm not sure, but it's a good way to actually become a part of the supply chain, because it relatively requires a lower investment, just about 30 to 40 million dollars. But it kind of draws away the semiconductor companies from Taiwan, which itself is facing its security concerns. So it would ideally look for other alternatives to have their bases. And India, with its it has brought out many various schemes like the PLI scheme, then the electronic manufacturing scheme, and varieties of that. So they are making some progress there. And right now, even the United States, they have brought out their CHIPS Act, that is like creating helpful incentives to produce semiconductors, so that they bring back the semiconductors back to the United States as well as a counter to China. So India, in that sense, could act as an interface there and again play a role. But with all that being said, implementation has been a problem when it comes to India and its semiconductor business. Similarly, in 2010 or at that time, Intel was trying to have a base in India. However, due to its long regulatory process and the bureaucratic red tapes, it had to shift to Vietnam, which is where it is currently situated. So similarly, the supply side constraints, the R&D level of investments that India has, which is somewhat low. So all these could somewhat pose a threat. But yeah, the government has, you could say that the government has recognized that this is an opportunity, and with all the slogans of Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India, some progress are being made so that India also becomes an important hub in the semiconductor business.
Right. Are there any other comments on this issue? I wanted to raise a point with regards to this issue itself. So this is something that I've looked at for quite some time. And the two issues that I see popping up is one, India's ease of doing business, and second is its technological expertise. With regards to ease of doing business, as Mallika had pointed out prior to this in prior conversations, that India's ease of doing business is rather horrible. And Modi, Prime Minister Modi, has sort of taken initiatives to improve ease of doing business by cutting down regulatory, loopholes, and basically taxation of MSMEs, for example. And he's sort of taken a real push forward in improving India's ease of doing business, not just domestically, but for foreign companies as well. We can see just by looking outside that how many companies from abroad are now setting up shop in India itself. Secondly, I think the issue that's more pertinent in this scenario is the technological expertise that India doesn't have right now. So if we look at the recent conversations, the diplomatic conversations that India is having, if we look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, one of India's key requirements from the US itself was, hey, we require technological expertise from your side. We require your companies to invest, not just monetarily. We do not want to be seen just as an outsourcing hub anymore. We want to be a partner where we ourselves can manufacture and build our own capabilities in the technological space. What I think India should model or is trying to model their technological environment is as a democratic and secular environment. Because what a lot of companies globally are now looking at is that, okay, if we have business with either US or China, we're going to be black marked in the future by either companies. And they can't have that sort of a stigma around them, considering how the global markets are so integrated that you need either of the two parties to function smoothly with. In the meanwhile, I think India could be a suitable alternative, simply because India doesn't have a lot of the backlog that the US-China tensions or the China-Taiwan issues have. India is seen as sort of this benign power. If you look at diplomatically, it has provided aid to so many countries around the world, and it is seen as a benign power who helps out when in need. And I think the technological space, considering the volume of activities in the technological space that we undertake. I think in that sense, India could be a suitable alternative with no sort of negative notions attached to us in that scenario. So I think there are no remaining point of contention to this issue. All right, I think that concludes today's session. I think we've pretty comprehensively talked about the China-Taiwan issue. Any other additive comments by any of you guys regarding this? No? Okay. So everyone, thank you for indulging in this conversation, and thank you for providing very comprehensive viewpoints, which I'm sure will add to the general discourse regarding the China-Taiwan issue. Thank you all of you for your participation.